Welcome everyone to Cyber Talk with Nikolay. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about typhoons, and I have with me in the studio and on this phone call, so two world-renowned meteorologists, Aaron Goldstein and Scott Scheferman. So we're going to be talking about all the weather that is happening in cybersecurity space. So before I turn them over, I'd like to read a little bit from what was happening in last year and around May. And May 2023, I'm sure everyone is aware of Typhoon Mawar that went through northern hemisphere and was pretty high, category 3 and 4 at times, and the winds were reaching at some points at 100 miles per hour, 190 miles per hour. And it went through the island in this particular area called Guam. And there are a few things that were happening at the time that this particular cyclone was moving through and ripping everything what was available, and people were hunkering down. But at the same time, certain things were unfolding in cyberspace because not everyone in this region had typhoon coming through, while people on Guam were essentially focusing on getting their things together and make sure that nothing bad happens. And surprisingly, nothing really bad happened, so everyone survived. There were no life lost, thank God, and there were damages to structures and floods and all that things happening. But the good thing, everyone survived and people rebuilt whatever they lost. But at the same time, silent threat actors were operating under the guise of Typhoon Mawar, and that's what we're going to be talking about. There were actors. It's called Volt Typhoon and South Typhoon, and today's our meteorologists, the world-renowned incident responders and threat hunters. Aaron and Scott will give us a little bit more ideas on what those typhoons were that were coming, that were coming from essentially China, and that's what everyone tries to believe in. And so China right now is peddling back certain things, and they're trying to say that was US originated. So we're not going to get into this political football that is going on between two countries, but we're going to focus more about what was happening and how those essentially typhoons were operating, who is behind, to the extent that we know, because some of the information may be a little bit not available to us, but nonetheless, I think conversation is going to be lovely. So with that said, Aaron, would you mind to talk a little bit about yourself in a few words? Just remind audience. I know you've been here before, so I'm pretty sure they recognize your name. And then we'll go to Scott, and then we'll start with Volt Typhoon. And I have a slew of questions. So Aaron, on to you.
Thank you, Nikolay. Always a pleasure to participate, and good to see you again, Scott. For those that I haven't met, I'm Aaron Goldstein. I'm VP of Incident Response at Todyl, and I have about 15 years of incident response and digital forensics consulting experience. A lot of really interesting activities coming from the Volt Typhoon, as well as Salt, which we'll get into. But really excited to be here and participate today, and I'll kick it over to Scott for an intro.
Thanks, Aaron. And for those that don't know, Aaron and I worked extensively together in the 2015 through 2017-18 era of DFIR, handling things like WannaCry, NotPetya. So we both have a lot of shared DFIR experience and affinity for one another and respect for one another. And I've got 30 years in cyber. A lot of that, most of that's consulting. Half of that for mostly DoD and intelligence and other types of federal kind of clients, and the other half in what you might call the vendor space. And most recently, in the last 3 years, I've been focusing heavily on the kind of the IT supply chain threat landscape, and the kind of East versus West information, IT war that's going on, and the race to quantum, and the race for AI, and natural resources, and all of that, and how that overlaps with cyber. And I also have a background in kind of the nexus of AI and cyber and things that Nikolay and I have talked about before on the show. And most recently, I'm working in a very unique space, taking care of the largest mansions and biggest billionaire personalities and high-profile people and family offices that there are. And it's funny, when this Volt Typhoon stuff started coming out, and the Flax Typhoon, and even Salt Typhoon, like those IOCs we had to operationalize because we put enterprise grade firewalls and endpoint EDR 24/7 SOC inside those giant mansions and homes and residences. And we had to because a lot of these actors are using that infrastructure. So I'm still being pulled into this, massive kind of cyber conflict between China and the West, if you will, even taking care of, high profile people and personalities. So it's kind of been interesting in that regard.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for the interest. Okay, so let's just dive into the topic. So, what do we know about? We'll get to Salt Typhoon, the one that actually made a lot of news lately in September, when every newspaper was writing about it and everyone was talking about it because implications certainly huge. But let's roll back a little bit into Volt Typhoon May 2023. What do we know and what actually Microsoft and the others were doing about helping understanding better where those typhoons are coming and what have we learned back in the day, what was behind or who was behind.
Go ahead, Aaron, you could start.
Certainly. From research, it seems that Volt Typhoon really kind of got started in mid 2021, and they were really targeting a lot of critical infrastructure, communication, and utilities. They've really used some common techniques, but methods that kind of let you remain undetected for as long as possible. So without diving too far into the TTPs off the bat, they were really using a lot of living off the land techniques to collect and stage the data. So really popular here to see compromise around small office, home office, routers, firewalls, networking equipment, some of what Scott's saying they're using enterprise grade specifically to avoid some of these types of issues. But yeah, things like the Fortinet, exploits that were out there gave these threat actors access into the network. And then once they did, it was pretty interesting because they're not dropping malware. They're using native commands and native utilities built into the systems that they're compromising to live off the land and blend in with regular traffic. So yeah, things like credential dumping and like NTDS util to export entire domain credential dumps, really common in these, and pretty interesting overall when we want to dive into some of the specific tactics.
Yeah, I would add to that just kind of the high level as well as this can be thought of as a massive apparatus that can be used for multiple purposes, but one of those would be a massive distributed denial of service tool. And like Aaron is saying, they hit a lot of Soho, a lot of residences, a lot of small appliances, including the enterprise grade ones, Cisco, Fortinet, the common ones that can be exploited remotely via remote code execution. But what a lot of people didn't realize is even though they were, not dismantled, but disrupted, it's still a very, very active campaign. And they immediately have shifted tactics. They started hitting new types of devices with new exploits. And you can't just bring something like that down because it's so well resourced, and it's been going on for 5 years. So if you think you've brought that kind of presence down in a network or on a device or in an environment, you probably haven't, because they've had 5+ years to do whatever they need to do to gain persistence and everything from a Hikvision camera to a domain controller to a VPN appliance through extra credentials, and all of that, like Aaron is saying, can be done and is done living off the land without a need for a traditional malware payload or remote code, and access trojan or anything like that. So this is still an ongoing threat. It's a big problem. It's likely based from the PLA's Strategic Support Force, the SSF. They've been targeting critical infrastructure. They have these long-term persistence approaches that just evade your ability to isolate and eradicate them as a threat. And that's what makes this so nefarious. I mean, yes, it can turn into a giant DDoS tool, but what else can't it do when you have that type of level root access on various devices and networks? There's not a whole lot you cannot do. You can even enable entirely new campaigns from another, PLA organization to come in right behind you. You're one command line away from uploading a piece of malware to all 260,000 or whatever devices that have been compromised, right? So it's very impactful.
Yes, definitely. And Scott and Aaron, so what I've heard you guys saying, there are certain techniques that they use to infiltrate organizations and remain there as stealthy as possible. And Aaron, you mentioned that they were not doing what typical threat actors are doing, deploying and dropping some malware and trying to exfiltrate certain things. So they were doing living off the land. They were using whatever organizations had to remain as stealthy as possible. So question would be, how would you describe their techniques and what made it possible for them to break into organizations and remain? Because they were not there for a couple days or a couple weeks. Volt Typhoon remained in certain organizations for extended period of time until certain things were discovered in 2023, and then companies start going back and retroactively look, and some organizations were discovered, and then they've been there almost for 5 years operating in their environment, and that's kind of extremely rare cases are extremely that were, if you go back right now, if you start talking to any organizations, how long do you keep your logs? It's default is 12 months. It's the longest one because that's what's required by most compliance auditors, that they come in and asking for that information. So organizations have tendency not to store for that long. So if you start thinking in terms of, okay, they were between 2 to 5 years, how much information somebody can obtain during this time when you not detect it and they're operating on your network. And can you just dive a little bit deeper? It's like when somebody gets into with this kind of access, like how did they get in, and then what they potentially can do while they sit there.
Absolutely. But first off, after helping and assisting MSPs primarily secure their downstream customers for years now, I would absolutely love if what you said about everyone having 1 year of log retention, I would love if that was true across the board, because the sad reality is oftentimes it's significantly less than that. So, yeah, there are plenty of times I would have loved to go in with a year retention and be able to put the pieces together. But to your point, it's pretty common, and this is not a bash on any vendor, but about every 6 months or so, you get a new Fortinet, you get a new D-Link or Netgear exploit that's out there, and so the rush is to go and patch, because most of the time the concern is around the ransomware threat actors. Those that are going to take that exploit, they're going to get into the network and then deploy their ransomware to extort their victims. But often overlooked are these threat actors that are more persistent, that are organized. The APT. I hate that term personally, but these advanced low and slow groups, they do the same thing. And Nikolay, you're asking, well, what are they doing and how are they getting in? By compromising at the network level and at these appliance level, they can pretty much have access to not only snoop on the traffic that's happening, but they can create new firewall rules. They can allow VPN connections. They can basically provision their own access to systems. And if they can't, what they can do is start sniffing traffic to get the usernames and credentials that they need. And they're purposely doing this very slowly and without heavy levels of detection, because they do want to take their time. They want to absorb and archive as much of that data as they can and exfiltrate it whenever. So what we're seeing with those types of attacks is they compromise the network appliance. They get onto one or more hosts, either by allocating their own access to it or by using credentials that they've compromised. And then they go slowly through and grab the data. They do credential dumps. They go and access the sensitive information. And in many of the cases, especially with Volt Typhoon, they're taking time to archive the information. And then we call it staging. So they'll stage all the data that they want to steal somewhere, and then they'll go low and slow to exfiltrate it out. Sometimes trying to hide it through like DNS tunneling and other methods that make it really hard to detect with regular normal traffic. And in some cases, I was even reading they're installing and running their own proxies like Impacket, specifically to avoid how that data is being sent out of the network. So there's a lot of different ways that they can do this, but essentially they're getting in at the highest level, and then they're provisioning their access, working their way through the network, harvesting as much data as they can, and then they'll set up persistence through a number of different ways. That way they can always have that foothold, even if they patch that vulnerability in the firewall or SSL VPN appliance.
Yeah. So you have to remember, like for Volt Typhoon, what's its mission, right? Like the most understood mission. While it can have many, whether it's confidentiality, integrity, availability, and all the rest, it's largely meant there to be able to disrupt communications in the case of, let's say, a Taiwan conflict, a political conflict. There's a lot of political kind of aspirations involved there, but this is why they needed all those Soho routers, because they couldn't afford this campaign to be discovered. It went 5 years successfully because you weren't seeing callbacks to Chinese address space. You were seeing callbacks to a Cox network, home network. You were seeing callbacks to anywhere other than China. And as Aaron was alluding to, when you have the edge device, everything that you're doing as activity is happening at the Linux level, at the kernel of the actual firewall or VPN appliance that you've exploited. That is not something the SecOps team, the NetSecOps team, the DFIR team, the SOC ever sees. So you have confidence that you have the ability to persist, which is why you can go low and slow, live off the land, don't need malware, don't need to move fast, don't even need to outrun defenses, because all the tools you're using are whitelisted or authorized or expected or are normal, right? They're not abnormal. So this is a way that, I mean, Russia's been doing this for a minute too, but China's gotten really good at it. And all three of the Typhoon campaigns, including Flax Typhoon, are very, very exquisite in their discipline to not move too fast or use tools that give them away or tactics that give them away. This is so much unlike what Aaron and I were dealing with in 25 through 2018. It's very much unlike. Yes, they were some living off the land going on 100%, but it was mixed in with payloads and malware and Mimikatz and all the, Empire and all that noise. They're not using those tools. They're tunneling through HTTPS. Your outbound traffic looks like normal web traffic that you can't block for business, right? So it's or DNS, right? So it's one of those things where you kind of step back and realize what's actually going on here and the level of power and how broad that power is spread around all of the West's critical infrastructure and Guam's as well. Also, obviously, part of the West in terms of that conflict. And you have a big problem. Now you start piling on things like Flax Typhoon or like Volt Typhoon. How effective were they? Well, it was little more than a month. They compromised a third of all Cisco RB320 routers, which are everywhere. They're ubiquitous. There's tens or if not hundreds of thousands of these things everywhere. Small offices, enterprises, and even homes. And they got 33% of them in like a little over a month. And we still didn't detect that. And those are known to be highly vulnerable devices that do get thought about and addressed from a risk perspective because they've had so many remote code execution CVEs. It's it's pretty wild when you step back.
No, it seems like it's a pretty tough case with Volt Typhoon and what they've done, and I've been reading a lot of it. And the reason I mentioned Mawar and Typhoon coming over and Guam, because some of it you were essentially alluding to, Scott. So Guam has the highest concentration of U.S. Forces at the moment in Asia Pacific. So all the major operations that happening in Taiwan, China, they essentially go in from Guam. There's a Navy base, there's Air Force base, and the Marines are coming from Okinawa relocating to Guam. So almost nearly 30% of population of Guam represents U.S. military. So it's heavily trafficked area right now where Chinese really wants to get in and understand better where all those strategic moves are. And as you guys said, there's tons of information you can glean into once you gain access to essentially the basis of communication. So you get access to hardware and you can control what is going on there. You can slowly take stuff off and you can read them at your leisure, not being discovered. And that seems like what was going on. And Scott, Aaron, so you were describing very well and clear what this compromise meant to organizations and how difficult it is. So now if you look from defenses, how they were discovered and what organizations could do, again, when you have somebody that you're dealing with with unlimited funds, unlimited time. They can be persistent for extended period of time. And I think, Aaron, you mentioned something along the line of APTs, which for some reason I haven't seen the classification of this typhoon as something that typically I would say APT some number and a bunch of other stuff. So they seem to be remain as typhoons, and they're just different versions. And I believe that there is a representation of a certain group in China that operates all those typhoons, and that they rebrand themselves or they change their tactics and then continue on. But from your perspective, it's like if you were, well, you are defenders right now, so you're helping organizations to detect those things. So how would you go about? What would you say? It's like, well, like in my case, I just want to make a jokes. Like I'm easy. I already bought D-Link router, so they can come in anytime they want. And so, but for all other organizations, if you want to essentially help organizations to get better. So, what would you say they need to do? And just kind of give us a little bit light and colors. Like, well, we cannot protect everything, but to a certain degree, we can at least detect certain disruptions that are happening because, again, their stated goals we don't know, but definitely they want it to remain in infrastructure as long as possible. And that's probably the reason why we're going to start talking about self Typhoon. They came back again, and they did even bigger things than they started with Volt Typhoon. So go for it, guys.
Yeah,
Well,
I think a lot of our defensive strategy. Sorry, Scott. I'll, I'll go. Yeah, so I think a lot of our defensive strategies are really the same as they have been. First and foremost, looking at the actual living off the land techniques that they're using PowerShell commands, they're using command line terminal commands, WMIC. These are all common things that most EDR and most security tooling can alert on. So first and foremost, having good security hygiene and having your EDR tools that can actually interrogate what's happening on the systems themselves. Also, your patch management, making sure your network appliances and all appliances are on the latest and greatest versions, constantly auditing the user accounts and behaviors from them, because you may not get those types of alerts from those appliances. So, maintaining good hygiene on those as well. But, a lot of this is going to be around, those endpoints and the network devices themselves. So if you are, interrogating what's happening on the systems, if you do have strong passwords, and if you're limiting administrative use, it makes it a lot harder, and it makes it a lot easier to trip alarms when they're trying to elevate their privileges. So threat actor gets into the network and they only have a limited user account. Now they have to do extra work to elevate their privileges, which will hopefully trigger more alerts that get you a leg up on the investigation. So these are not impossible tasks to help defend against, but it is difficult because they are purposely trying to avoid that detection. So, your patch management, your EDR, and good security hygiene are all really good vectors to help make this harder for even targeted threat attacks.
from my perspective, there are tactical things you can do, but I think, if you're an organization, this is one of those campaigns that you want to really lean into and leverage, because the campaign illuminates a fact that most organizations that are impacted or that have seen alerts related to IOCs, people forget, like, you're blocking, let's say, domains or IPs, and you get a hit and you go, I'm going to block that, right? Or you feel like you've crossed off that IOC, but that's not this story. This story, if you have any activity coming from inside your network, for example, going outbound, that you've identified even remotely close to these types of campaigns, you have to be willing and honest with yourself to take a step back and break all the assumptions that you have in your mind, and realize that you've lost potentially, or even likely, with this actor, with their how adept they are at living off the land, you've likely lost your security control of your environment. Now, you can talk motives all day long. You can try to put them in a box of TTPs that you feel good about understanding. And you can try to feel good about having contained a device that was infected or impacted. But you haven't yet stepped back to say, I probably have bigger problems, and I really need to understand my back to basics, your architecture. Are you microsegmenting? How many Hikvision cameras do you have in your environment? Because those are probably popped, right? The assumptions you make when you're containing are really important to step back and just be honest, and then use that internally to go to the board, go to the other stakeholders, go to SecOps, NetSecOps, and say, guys, we don't have a little problem that's just an incident. We have something we actually need to actually address holistically across everything. I mean, your HR systems could be impacted. Your VPN, your most with the remote workforce these days, if your VPN appliance is a thing that got popped from this campaign, you have way bigger problems than just that threat actor. You have a very strong propensity for that device to be bricked, that device to be not performant, not accessible, for admins to get locked out arbitrarily if they wanted to do that thing. You have processes at the kernel level going on that you can't see that aren't being logged to the device's kernel. So you have to break your assumptions once you have this type of actor in your environment, or even close to, or in your supplier, or in your, you have VPNs to other B2B type of businesses. You have problems, right? So I don't know how else to overstate this. Maybe I have overstated it, but I think that when you lose security control, you have to be honest with yourself, and you can't just cross off an event as easily as you can in, let's say, an overtly obvious ransomware type of attack, right? Or remote access Trojan. Those can also have the wrong assumptions made. You thought those contain them. But this actor living off the land, you're not going to have in your time wrinkle you look at, are you going back 5 years? No, because you can't. Are you going back 1 year? Like Aaron said, probably not. So let's say you roll back a month or two. What are you going to look at? Well, you're probably not tooled to look at the things you normally look at that give you a nice high critical alert because you saw Mimikatz or you saw WMI, and this is overtly, obviously bad. You can't just start with the obvious. You have to start with the non-obvious, and you have to use a lot of context and inference in your thinking to understand what may have taken place and what the scope of that compromise in your environment might be. And that's not easy, to Aaron's point, but it is possible.
One other thing I'll just add there is oftentimes these small home office firewalls and network appliances, you're lucky if you have 24 hours worth of logs on them. And what is the response when somebody thinks it's compromised? Oh, they're going to factory reset it. Well, there goes all your logs and any potential web shell or other artifacts that were there that could help reconstruct when it was popped and things like that. So oftentimes the response is, let's clean it up and wipe it and move on. But that can really destroy the critical evidence you might have. So making sure that you do respond properly. Hopefully you have an IR plan that you can follow, but if not, working with a vendor or third party that can assist you with these things, absolutely critical to make sure you're not throwing away the precious artifacts that might exist.
Well, I don't often try to one up my friend Aaron, but what I'm going to say about these edge devices and persistence, my experience with Eclipsium taught me something that I had really never realized before prior to that experience, which is that when you get root on these devices, there are ways to persist on them that survive that reboot and even survive the firmware update to the latest patched version. And you're still there as a threat actor after all of that. So not only, to Aaron's point, did you lose your logs and ability to actually make sense of what might have happened, but you don't even know that you know whether or not that actor is still there. If I ran a large enterprise, I would fight every single day to have a redundant standby device for my edge appliances. I don't want to wipe and reboot. I want to just literally take a new device that's patched to the latest and pray. You know what I mean? Because even that's not the full mitigation sometimes, right? So, because they'll come back in from the inside with the admin credentials they got off of the first device that you just took offline. So these VPN endpoint devices, especially the VPN appliances, are literally the most primo real estate in the world for any attacker. There's no better real estate. Active Directory, pretty bad. Edge device, even worse.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of interesting case. So one thing I was thinking while we were discussing what potentially it goes old adage is like you turn off your computer and you're safe now. So that's one solution that nobody wants to revert to. But I want to exploit this hypothetical conversation that's been going on for quite some time. Where does zero trust comes to play in this conversation? So if, let's say, organizations had implemented zero trust, would it be possible for Typhoon to pull this off? It seems to me that it still would be possible, but what do you guys think about it?
I'll go first and short and sweet. Nobody gets to zero trust. We all know that. But even if they could and have, zero trust being verify then trust, right? In that order, at the process level, zero trust, if perfectly implemented in a perfect day with perfect context, would allow people to say that this process should not have done that thing, even if it was authorized to do that thing. And so context is, in a very hypothetical world, what you actually need to do perfect zero trust. It's very hard to only use rules-based mechanisms and logic to implement zero trust in a way that an actor like Volt Typhoon can't still. It'd be harder for them, but they can't still get around or work within, I should say. So that's my short answer on zero trust, let alone the reality of zero trust being an impossible North Star.
Impossible North Star. I really like that. So yes, I was going to say that zero trust in theory and sometimes in practice can be super helpful as a security control, but not the dedicated solution to all the problems. First off, I agree with Scott. I don't think I've ever seen a full zero trust implementation that was perfect and that would completely, segment everything and every process and network connection that shouldn't be there. So it sounds good in theory, but the reality is probably slightly different. I do think it can make things a lot harder for the threat actors. And that's where, earlier I was talking about, we want to set off more alarms. We want to make the barrier to entry more difficult. That lateral movement and inability to, access other systems that they want to compromise could make it more difficult and could create more alerts and more forensic artifacts to put the pieces together and catch them. But I don't think zero trust is going to be the silver bullet to solving these problems. Can it help as a security control? Yes, but unless it's a layered approach with multiple other controls, it's very ambitious to say that it would prevent these types of things.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for part 1 with Cyber Talk with Nikolay, with Aaron Goldstein and Scott Scheferman on the episode Typhoons Are Coming. Stay tuned for part 2.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about these topics or IS Squared, please go to www.issquaredinc.com.